It's Dina Kesbeh, lead producer here. I want to talk to y'all about a recent report from the Environmental Integrity Project. It showed that from 2019 to 2021, 6 Houston area refineries had dumped 55 gallons of chemicals in the Houston Ship Channel and other public waterways. As crazy as that sounds, it was all done legally. So I'm wondering, what? How on earth could that amount of chemicals being dumped in our water be legal? Should we all be freaking out? Here to answer all my questions is contributor Loren Steffy. It's Monday, March 6th. I'm Dina Kesbeh, and here's what Houston's talking about today. Loren, thank you so much for joining us again. We've missed you.
Happy to be here.
All right, let's get into it. This was a story that the entire team was just like, oh my God, like freaking out over. There was millions of gallons of chemicals that were dumped into the Houston Ship Channel and other public waterways legally. And I was just reading the chemicals. Some of them, I don't even know how to pronounce, how to even read it. It was so complicated. And seeing that going into our water is absolutely horrifying. How is that even allowed? How is that even legal?
Well, the way the federal regulations work with things like the Clean Water Act is they don't prohibit the release of chemicals into the water. They set limits for how much, how many particles per million or whatever are allowed, under the law. And so, the recognition is that when you have something like a refinery, it's going to produce bad stuff. I mean, it just, unfortunately, the byproduct of what they do, there's a lot of chemicals involved, and just runoff alone, could cause some of that to be released. And so there's sort of this recognition that there's always going to be some amount of, for lack of a better term, bad stuff that's coming out of these things. But, there are harmful levels and then there are acceptable levels, and that's what the law tries to distinguish between. Of course, the real issue here is that a lot of those laws were written 40, 50 years ago, and they may not be as up to date as they need to be.
Right. Yeah. I mean, do we have any footing to even freak out as just regular civilians who don't really follow regularly what refineries are dumping into our water, and seeing and reading that it's millions of gallons? Is it alarming?
I mean, it's alarming. I guess anybody has the freedom to freak out if they want to. Right. It is something that doesn't get a lot of attention. I think most people aren't aware of the fact that these releases happen and that they are legal under the law. And, look, over time, these things can build up. We know from studies that have been done, in the 10 years after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, for example, that, there was a lot of chemicals and oil residue that has accumulated on the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, for example. So we haven't done a great job scientifically of determining the long-term effects of having some of these things in the water. How do they affect, fish, for example, waterfowl? That was one of the things that they actually did study after the Deepwater Horizon, and they found that some of these chemicals can actually change the sex of fish so that they can't reproduce. There was I forget what type of fish it was, but anyway, there's a lot of things like that are being studied now that we didn't have the technology to study back when these laws were written. And so I don't know that we shouldn't be freaking out, but we should be taking perhaps a harder look at some of these regulations and seeing if we need to update them to reflect what we now know.
No, that's so true. I mean, you had mentioned that there is an acceptable amount. Granted, these refineries have broken and surpassed the quote-unquote acceptable amount and have been fined for it. Why is there even an acceptable amount, especially now given that we have present-day research pointing at the issues, the long-term issues that this could potentially have? How do they even determine an acceptable amount? How do you say you're allowed to dump this many chemicals in our water and it's totally fine, we're good?
Well, legislation gets written by negotiation and compromise, right? And so You had one side that really didn't want to have the regulations at all, and another side that wanted to, protect the waterways. And so where's an acceptable point where we can come together? That's kind of how you get there. The other thing I would point out that in addition to the laws having been written many years ago, a lot of these refineries are actually very old facilities. Parts of them, at least, had been built, as far back as the 20s. And so bringing them up to a modern standard can cost billions and billions of dollars. And what you're seeing now is we all need gasoline still, right? But if you're a company that owns a refinery and you're saying, well, do I want to invest $5 or $10 billion in this facility if gasoline demand is going to drop off in 10 years and everybody's going to drive electric cars? Maybe not, right? You may not get that money back. And so that actually complicates this issue of protecting the waterways, because there may not be a lot of incentive for these companies to spend that money. And this being Texas, we are not going to see the regulatory crackdown that you might in some other places. So,
I know. That's true. That's true. I'm just curious, how are environmentalists responding to that report?
I haven't actually heard how they're responding to that particular report. Generally, environmentalists get outraged about these things, and that's honestly, that's their role. It is to be kind of a megaphone for these things and to make sure that the public is aware of what's happening. And many years ago, I interviewed a CEO of a major oil company, and he said something that I thought was very interesting. He said, our industry is a lot better because of the environmentalists. He's like, we all get tired of them nagging us, but they have made us operate more safely, more cleanly, and just more efficiently than we would have if we had been left to do it on our own. And so I do think that, within the industry, there's always a lot of pushback against environmental organizations, but they do serve a purpose, and they do kind of move us in the right direction. So, these are concerns that we need to be constantly reassessing and looking at. And we don't necessarily need to overreact, but we do have to kind of recognize the fact that, again, from a scientific standpoint, we just know a lot more about the long-term effects of some of these chemicals than we used to. And we're dealing with an industry that, quite frankly, has a long history of trying to minimize those long-term concerns and sort of say, well, we don't really know because we don't have any information on. It goes back to in the 1920s when the industry pushed leaded gasoline. And even though we knew lead was an industrial toxin, the industry's response was, we don't really know that it's a problem if it's in gasoline. Well, it was, we did kind of know that, and we certainly know it now. And so, the industry has its own agenda, and it's not necessarily in the long-term best interest of the public, but we also need their products. So that's why we have an industry to begin with. So, it's a balancing act.
I know. Thinking about it from a completely different perspective, right? The chemicals have to go somewhere. They have to dump it somewhere. Where else could they put out this discharge? Where else could it go?
You've kind of hit on the crux of the problem. Most of these petrochemical plants and refineries are located in places like the Houston Ship Channel because they need easy access to waterways, right? So that tankers can bring in raw materials, they can ship out refined products. And that is the most efficient way of moving that stuff. And so they're all near waterways. And quite frankly, the easiest way to discharge this stuff is to release it into the water because it's right there. The only other option you have is to capture it and transport it someplace and bury it, things like that. And some of that happens not necessarily with this type of waste, but with other types of waste, which we saw, for example, with the train derailment in Ohio, right? They excavated a lot of the contaminated soil and they tried to ship it to Texas. But in fairness, the EPA has sites where they have established. My wife saw that and she's like, why are they sending it to us?
Right?
And I said, well, because the railroad doesn't maintain a facility in case this happens, right? But the EPA does. The government actually has facilities ready to go to handle this stuff, and it's built to certain standards so that it can be contained and all that. And we actually want that as taxpayers. We would rather it be stored in a place that we know is safe and that has been designed to hold this kind of stuff than something we're forcing a company to do and on the fly, right? We don't have time to make sure they're not cutting corners and things like that. So There are ways to dispose of this stuff, but as a practical matter, when you're talking about something about like refinery waste, that's probably just not going to happen.
Okay. And I saw Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee tweet about it and talk about how this really has to stop. I remember we even, just talking about the dumping of the chemicals in our wastewater. We, one of our producers was able to, in a separate interview, was asking the mayor about it, and he actually had no idea that this was even happening.
Does the city have any plans on addressing the recent report about the Environmental Integrity Project about dumping waste into the waters? Basically, there's 6 refineries in the Houston area that's pumping 55 million gallons of wastewater into the Houston Ship Channel and other public waterways.
And that I will have to take a look at, because we certainly don't want that to happen. Mm-hmm. And if, for example, the facts are that that's the case, then I think we're going to do everything we can to stop that. That is not what we should be doing in the city of Houston. And quite frankly, if it's occurring, it needs to stop like yesterday.
So I'm curious, at the local level, what can we do to address this? And should we address it?
Yeah, I mean, most of the regulations you're talking about, they really need to come at the state level, because, a lot of these facilities are not actually, in the city limits of Houston, for example, or they're, but they're close by, and they could. So, we saw this going back to the Texas City explosion in the late 40s, right? I mean, that plant was actually outside of municipal jurisdiction, and that was part of the reason that tragedy occurred. And yet the consequences were borne very much by the city, right? So what you want to have is a broader regulatory scheme, and that ought to be at the state level. Unfortunately, in Texas, we have the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which I have, and many years ago, dubbed them the loving lapdog of polluters. I mean, they work very closely with the industry. A lot of the people there are actually priming for jobs going to work for the very companies they regulate because they can make more money. And so it's not a very strong regulatory enforcement process that they have, and I think that's unfortunate. But that has been a characteristic of Texas for many, many years. We like industry, we want the jobs, we are willing to sort of play this role, and this is the trade-off we make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you brought up the explosion in the 40s that happened, and now with them stopping the shipment, for now at least, I don't know, I'm curious how long things like that have been happening, where we would have from different states toxic chemicals shipped into Texas. How does that fit into the whole grand scheme of us having this abundance of toxic wastewater around us, and now even having them shipped from outside? Because I actually never even knew that. I always thought it was just every state figured it out on their own. I didn't think we were getting toxic chemicals from outside, from a different state.
Well, I mean, keep in mind, in Texas, we have a lot of wide open spaces. So if you're going to bury toxic waste, we have a lot of places that you can do that, and it doesn't, it minimizes the impact. And the other thing that's worth pointing out is a lot of those things that happen in rural areas, this can be an economic benefit for areas that don't have a lot of other options. So, there was a plan, I don't know, 10 years ago or so to bury nuclear waste in West Texas at one point. And I think that went away. But, that was one of the things that was pointed out, was where they were going to do it. You need people to constantly monitor that, and that creates jobs. And, this was an economically depressed area where there weren't a lot of opportunities. And so that comes into play too. But I do think, coming back to the idea of the local involvement, at the very least, local officials ought to know what's happening. And I think the public has a right to know what's happening as well, because, these are complex problems, and there are kind of these vast networks for dealing with them, but we have a right to know how it works. We shouldn't be asking ourselves these questions after the fact, right? We should know how this stuff works. For example, what are the restrictions on toxic chemicals being shipped through the city of Houston? There's rail lines all through the city. I believe there are restrictions against shipping, certain chemicals, but it'd be worth knowing, right? I mean, the public should be asking these questions.
Yeah, especially when a lot of people don't know.
Yep.
Even the fact that there was the whole report that came out where they said millions of gallons were legally being dumped into Houston's waters. I mean, I'd feel like some of our listeners would wonder, how does that really affect me? Should I care? Should I not care? For people who really just don't know anything about it, what would you say is the most important factor as to why they really should pay attention?
Well, I think with any of this stuff, education is the key. I mean, if you're concerned about it, you should find out. But also understand that there's a reason these limits exist. And we can debate whether those limits are correct or whether they need to be adjusted and that kind of thing. But we can't have that debate if we don't have informed people talking about it, right? And it's not a question of one side is right and the other side is wrong. The industry is not all bad. The industry provides a lot of benefit for Texas, for Houston, for the country. And that has to be weighed against the environmental costs that's being borne by that and the costs that people living in and around these areas have to deal with. What is not acceptable is the way it has been done in the past is a lot of the people living near these areas have not had the economic or political means to have any say. And that's not okay. You can't have people living in, areas where they're exposed to toxic chemicals, for example, just because they can't afford to live anywhere else. That's not an acceptable solution. And I think we have made some progress on that, but there's more to be done.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Loren, anything else that I might have missed that you want to make sure you get across?
I guess the ultimate issue here is that if we want to get in our cars and be able to go where we need to go, for right now, this is a big part of the cost of that. And it's more than just gasoline. I mean, that's kind of the biggest thing when we talk about refineries, but we're also talking about petrochemical plants. So, if you want your fleece pullover and your, whatever, I mean, there's a price we pay for that. And we kind of hide it from ourselves. We don't often think about that, but this is the balancing act we have to do as a result of that. And it's easy to say, oh, this is bad. We shouldn't be dumping this stuff. And it's like, okay, well, the easiest way to not dump it is to not create it in the first place. But then we're not going to be able to go anywhere. So we're not going to be able to get goods that we want and things like that. So, it is a question of finding that balancing act, and it's not quite as clear cut as it often seems when you first look at it.
Mm-hmm. And in Houston, you can't get anywhere if you don't have a car. It's not one of those cities.
And not only that, but in Houston, the refining industry, the petrochemical industry, these are major employers that have been a part of the city for a very long time. And so, in many ways, you're talking about one of the core industries that made Houston what it is. So, again, it's a tricky balancing act.
That's very true. Loren, thank you so much for coming on today.
You bet. Thank you.
That was our contributor, Loren Steffy, that you just heard. All right, before y'all go, the Miller Outdoor Theater is celebrating 100 years this year. And with that, they've announced their first concert of the year. On March 17th, you'll be able to get some fresh air, a little picnic, and a concert. And you might want to dress in green because it'll be on St. Patrick's Day. It'll feature the Trinity Irish Dance Company. And if you can't catch that one, don't worry. There will be several other concerts this month, including a Michael Jackson tribute. So if you love the outdoors and you love free fun, this is the spot. Check it out. That's all I got for y'all today on CityCast Houston. Tomorrow, we'll be back with another episode of our Food Tuesday show. This time, we've got the food blogger Sean the Food Sheep. Don't miss it, because he's going to hit your sweet tooth where it hurts. He's going to tell you all about the hidden gems from around our city. Till then, ta-ta! I definitely went in this freaking out, and I'm coming out of it being like, yeah, I kind of need my car.